Hello, Petal. How you doing? Thank you very much for coming back for Chapter 4 of The Better Mousetrap, J.W. Wells & Co. Book 5 by Tom Holt. How's your week going? Does your week start on a Monday? Or does it start on another day? Either way, I hope you're having a good week. And of course, I've got to do the thing. If you enjoy listening to my recordings, please hit the like button, share, hit the notifications bell if you want to keep following the series, and if you really like it, then please subscribe to the channel. It's very, very much appreciated, and it just helps me keep it all going. And it just brings me so much joy when I get comments from you guys. It's always good to hear from you, and it's nice to be able to share this book with you. So, yeah, great seeing you here, and I appreciate each and every one of you. So, on with the show. Right, try and be a grown-up now and get it started. Here we go. We got this. Chapter 4. Mr. Sprague sighed deeply, put the file down on his desk, and rang through to his secretary.
"Hello," he said. "Please put a message through to Frank Carpenter. You'll find the contact details in."
A shadow fell on Mr. Sprague's face. He looked up. "Twice in 1 week," Frank said. "That's unusual." Mr. Sprague closed his eyes and slowly opened them.
"Please don't do that," he said. "You know I find it extremely disconcerting."
Frank shrugged. "Sorry," he said. "From there, I take it you haven't actually sent for me yet."
"No, I was just about to."
"Ah, slight miscalculation then." Frank closed the door, caught it as it slid off the wall, rolling itself up as it went, and tucked it into his cardboard tube. It isn't easy, you know, plotting these things to the exact moment. Anyway, I got your message. Well, obviously I did, and the file. He was holding a green wallet folder. Mr. Sprague tried not to look at an identical folder sitting on his desk. Identical that was, apart from the fact that the version Frank was holding contained a 10-page briefing document that hadn't been dictated or typed out yet. It was things like that, Mr. Sprague decided, that made him question the wisdom of hiring Frank Carpenter. Little things that get lodged under the dental plate of the unconscious mind long after the big, vague issues have been chewed over and swallowed.
"That's all right then," Mr. Sprague said. "So, you know the backstory?"
Frank nodded. "Actually," he said, "there's a few things about it that seem a bit fishy to me. Not that it matters, I suppose, if I'm going to make it so it never happened."
"Fishy?"
"Well, I thought so. I mean, think about it for a moment." Frank was hovering next to a chair. He never sat down unless invited. Mr. Sprague nodded, and Frank took a seat. Somehow, every chair Frank sat in seemed to fit him exactly. "There's this woman, right? She's a professional pest controller, monster hunter, whatever you chose to call it. Did you know my dad was one of those, by the way, when he was in the trade? Wasn't terribly good at it, so he said. Only ever killed one dragon, and that was by sitting on the poor thing, by accident. Anyhow."
"Your father was in the—"
"Didn't I mention it? Oh, yes. Eons ago, back in the... sorry, about 3 years ago. J.W. Wells & Co. They've gone bust since then. Anyhow, that's beside the point. She's a professional dragon slayer, so you'd think she'd be fairly, well, agile, fit, good at climbing things, you know. And then she gets herself killed, falling out of a tree, trying to rescue some old deer's cat."
"Accidents happen,"
Mr. Sprague said, with feeling. "Maybe," Frank said, "but I remember some of the stories Dad used to tell me about his old boss, Ricky something. Quite the action hero, always jumping out of windows and scaling tall buildings and stuff. I can't imagine him falling out of a tree." Mr. Sprague frowned.
"Never heard of him," he said. "I don't know. Maybe she got overconfident and careless, showing off. To be honest with you, I'm not all that concerned about how it happened or why. All that concerns me is that her employers had her insured for £11 million, which I'm going to have to pay unless you can go back and stop it happening. Not the most challenging assignment I've given you, I wouldn't have thought." "Fine." Frank held up a conciliatory hand. "None of my business. I entirely agree. You just have to leave it with me and I'll see what I can do." Mr. Sprague sighed. A great many things about Frank Carpenter irritated him unbearably, but so far
he'd never failed to complete an assignment. £9.9 million, which would otherwise have drifted out of his life like lost orphan lambs, weren't likely to be going anywhere after all. Mr. Sprague arranged his face in a tolerably close imitation of a smile.
"Splendid," he said. "Usual terms, of course."
Frank said. Mr. Sprague knew all about that. It meant Frank was about to make difficulties.
"Was there something?"
he said. Well, yes, Frank got so coy when he was about to ask for more money. Thing is, well, you know that before I do a job I run the projections. I just need to make sure I won't alter history and start a war or cause a plague, epidemic or anything. Mr. Sprague nodded.
"What about it?"
Frank clicked his tongue. Mr. Sprague was familiar with that one too. It was generally even more expensive than an Well, actually, it's all a bit technical, really. All to do with, magic and things.
"Oh."
Because she's, because she's in the trade, you see, tracking component variables and extrapolating data from our predictions. It's all based on the assumption that, well, people are normal. Normal-ish, anyhow. I mean, they've got to be a bit different, or they wouldn't try overtaking on the inside at 90 miles an hour, or nipping behind the bulk hydrogen tanks for a quick smoke, and all the funny little things that people do. But stupidity's perfectly normal. I mean, it's a defining characteristic of the species. So it's dead easy to allow for it in the synthetic projection matrix. Mr. Sprague looked at him.
"The what?"
Frank flushed slightly. "Oh," he said, "sort of meth stuff. You don't need to bother about it."
"I happen to have a doctorate in pure mathematics from the Sorbonne,"
Mr. Sprague said frostily,
"but I don't seem to remember anything called a synthetic
projection matrix."
"That's it. Of course," he added. "My attention might have been wandering at that point in the lecture, or maybe I was in bed with a cold or something. Unlikely, though."
Frank's ears were glowing pink. "Actually," he said, "I don't think it's been discovered yet. In fact, I know it hasn't because it's, one of mine. Little something I knocked up so I could do these projections, you see."
"I see. One of yours?"
"Afraid so. Started off with something I had to deal with to get the simulations up and running. Turned into a bit of a hobby. In fact, I only just missed out on the Nobel Prize the year before, in 20 years' time. Pipped to the post by a very clever old bloke from Malaysia. Would you believe he's managed to calculate the square root of, He hesitated. He said, "Better not go into that. Might be letting the cat out the bag. Anyway, yes, I like to dabble a bit here and there. I got the algorithm, you see." He frowned. "Sorry, what were we... Oh, yes, people in the trade. Point is, they're bloody hard to plot. They keep nipping in and out of alternative realities and post-sequential subordinate timelines and all sorts of aggravating stuff like that. Makes tracking them a bit like catching a net with a butterfly in it. And the bottom line is, lots more sums to do, which means lots more work, which in turn calls for..." He didn't say lots more money, because it wasn't necessary. Mr. Sprague pulled a sad face.
"What did you have in mind?"
he said. Frank shifted uncomfortably. "Would 20% be really greedy?" he said. "Only, I'll probably have to invent a whole new methodology for calibrating the self-cancelling resonances. Plus I'll need to do all the calculations in base 8 and base 12 as well as base 10 because of a lot of stuff that I better not tell you about, because if it gets discovered before the next US presidential election, there's likely to be this sort of global holocaust thing. So you're going to have to..."
13.
15.
"Agreed,"
said Mr. Sprague, and then he added,
"Base 8.
"You really do need to forget I said that." "Just think," Frank added with rather more cunning than he'd have credited himself with, "of all the insurance claims there'd be if Plymouth got wiped off the map by a cryomolecular bomb."
"Cryo..."
Mr. Sprague's eyebrows disappeared into his hair.
"Oh," he said. "Fine. 15% then. After all," he added with a mild shudder, "it's not as though I have a choice."
"Not if the poor woman's already dead," Frank said sympathetically. "Forces your hand, rather. I can see that. And I promise it really is just because of the extra calculations. I mean, for the run-of-the-mill jobs, I've always considered 10% is more than fair. Anyhow, there it is. Sorry. Mr. Sprague sighed.
It's a deal, then,
he said.
I'll look forward to...
He stopped. He'd just noticed something.
No dog today, then?
Frank nodded. Actually, he said, lowering his voice to a whisper, I think I may have given the wretched thing the slip.
Oh, you mean... I thought you liked...
Me? Frank shook his head industriously. Not a bit of it. Don't like dogs, and as a general rule, dogs don't like me. Usually it's ears back and deep growling as soon as they clap eyes on me, which is fine, he added. Nothing harder than trying to be friends with someone you can't stand just because they happen to like you. And even more so, bloody dogs. Mind you, he's wandered off before, and just when I think it's safe and I can carry on my life, I go through the door and there he is, curled up on the other side and waiting for me. You know, the way they do. Mr. Sprague grinned unpleasantly.
You'll miss him,
he said. No chance, Frank said quickly. Douglasness means not having to go around with a pocket full of plastic bags, not to mention eating food that hasn't got a wet, snuffly nose in it. You know what? For the first time in ages, I feel like I really have a future. Mr. Sprague nodded.
You more than most people. Several, in fact.
Frank smiled bleakly. Time travel jokes, he said. When I retire, I'm going to put them all in the book, provided there's still enough rainforest left to provide that much paper. Anyhow, mustn't keep you. I know you're a busy man, although, he added, grinning faintly, by the time I meet you again, this little chat won't have happened, so I needn't feel quite so guilty about it.
Hold on,
Mr. Sprague said, frowning as an unpleasant thought occurred to him.
What you just said, does that mean, well... Does it mean there's great chunks of my life, when I'm talking to you, or working on cases that you end up making never happen?
His mouth was unaccountably dry, though he did his best not to let it show.
What I mean is, what happens to them? And what about the man who's talking to you right now? Do I get, well, rewound or something, and then recorded over after you've...
Frank beamed at him. You know, he said cheerfully, you always ask me that. Cheerio. The door opened in a red brick wall in a dusty courtyard shaded from the oppressive sun by an ancient fig tree. It disturbed the concentration of a big stocky man with a long grey beard as he sat under the tree sketching a design for some sort of machine. He looked up, recognised Frank Carpenter, and nodded. How's it coming? Frank said, in a somewhat archaic dialect of Italian, though of course the words had been modern English when he framed them in his mind. One of the things he loved about the door was its attention to detail.
Bloody thing, the man replied. I mean, birds don't have this problem. They just hop off the edge of the nest and it happens. They don't have to give themselves headaches figuring out surface-to-weight ratios.
As he spoke, he was doodling a man's head in the margin.
The way I see it, if God had meant us to fly, he'd have given us
imagination, Frank said, and a pair of opposable thumbs. Stick at it, and you'll get there in the end. You'll see. The man glanced down at his piece of paper, then looked up again. There was a faint gleam of cunning behind his eyes.
Of course, he said, you know all about this stuff. Where you come from.
When I come from, Frank corrected him. And yes, we know, but I don't, if you follow me. Specialisation, it's the curse of our age, whereas your lot, we have a saying in my time, Renaissance man, means a man who can do pretty much anything if he sets his mind to it. The grey-bearded man muttered something vulgar, crumpled up the sheet of paper and threw it away.
Oh, come on, he said. One little hint wouldn't kill you.
Not me, maybe, Frank sighed. He didn't like saying no to people, particularly those he'd admired for as long as he could remember. Look at it this way, he said. If I told you, it'd be cheating. You'd miss out on the wonderful sense of achievement that you only get from doing it all yourself.
Fine, as opposed to missing out on 100,000 Florentine ducats.
A thought occurred to him.
20% of which could be yours, he said. If only you didn't have such fine principles.
Frank shook his head. You'll get there in the end, he said. The grey-bearded man said something which the door translated perfectly, which was a pity. Frank shrugged and watched him stomp off in a huff. When he was out of sight, he picked up the discarded ball of paper and smoothed it out. It was, of course, horribly tempting, and what harm could it do? He looked at it again, sighed, and dropped it. He'd read the book and seen the film, though he didn't think it was quite as bad as everybody made out. The last thing he wanted to do was be responsible for a sequel. He settled himself down under the shade of the fig tree, looked around to make sure he was alone, and flipped open the cover of his palm top. Nowhere and nor when quite like the 15th century Tuscany, he always reckoned, for doing really, really heavy maths. It was the clean air, or the scent of the lavender, or something. He pressed a button and the screen began to glow. Cheating, Frank thought. It could be so easy. It could be something as simple as taking this perfectly ordinary Kawagachia XPK36 back to a computer hardware manufacturer in, say, 2005 and letting them salivate over it for a minute or two before naming his price. 30 years difference. Close enough in time that the potential buyer would realise what it was and eventually be able to figure out how it worked and how to copy it. But 30 years in the electronics biz is the same sort of gap that separates, well, the space shuttle and Leonardo da Vinci. One little act of betrayal and he could have, if not all the money in the world, then at least a substantial proportion of it. But even his poxy little Kawagachia palm top, last year's model, practically an antique, had enough computing power to run the simulation that'd show him how catastrophically disastrous that move would be. Cryomolecular bombs would be coloured lights and candy floss compared with what would happen if a turn-of-the-century caveman got his hands on post-Enlightenment technology, which was why it was so essential, he reckoned, that the door either stayed hidden in a very deep, dark place, or else came to live with just the right sort of person, someone with principles, yes, but principles in moderation. The thought of the utter carnage that would result from the door falling into the moist little hands of an idealist, someone who only wanted to make the world a better place, was enough to melt your brain until it started dribbling out of your ears. Frank Carpenter was realistic about his own intellect, talent, and worth, but he couldn't help feeling that he met the door's ownership criteria fairly well. Moderately bright while being intelligent enough to know that a great many people were cleverer than he was. Selfish enough to have a vested interest in keeping it secret and safe, shallow enough not to be tempted to use it for the betterment of mankind, and with just enough traces of decency clinging to the bottom of the barrel to care about the consequences. He read through the dead girl's biographical information for the 4th time and set about the ticklish job of reducing it all to numbers. It was maths, sure enough, no insight or intuition required. You read the words and translate them into figures, as simple and scientific as that. But he couldn't help feeling there was a little bit more to it, and that, for some reason he couldn't quite understand, it wasn't something that just anybody with a postgraduate degree and a calculator could do, even though he'd proved the formulae over and over again to the point where he was completely satisfied that they were right and they worked. This stage of the job always struck him as a cross between number crunching and playing pinball with a blindfold on. Frank concentrated. Maths was one of the few things he could actually concentrate on. It hooked his mind in a way that mere words or events somehow never could. Gradually, the shapes began to form. Lines intersected like a worm-eaten underground map. Clusters formed and clotted. Paths bifurcated, ran parallel and rejoined. What he hadn't told George Sprague was that he'd failed to get his Nobel Prize because, compared to him, the judges had only just mastered the 6 times table. The silly thing was, he was entirely self-taught. Dad belonged to the 9-10 lot school of numeracy, and at the progressive school that Mum had insisted on sending him to, maths was even more optional than all the other subjects. Indeed, there were moments during his occasional outbreaks of self-doubt when he wondered whether it was really the door doing all these clever sums, the way it translated languages and sometimes supplied him with memories of relevant historical and geographical data that he knew for a fact he'd never learned. It was possible, but he doubted it. 3 a.m, thinking, and even he knew better than to pay it much attention. He stopped. The numbers. Frank thought about it for a moment, then went back and did the last 3 sets of equations again, this time in base 8. It made no difference. He frowned. The numbers. Yes, of course it sounded ridiculous when he tried to put it into words. Nevertheless, the numbers simply weren't working. It was as though someone had switched off the gravity and suddenly everything was in free fall without mass or density, as though all the numbers had suddenly become interchangeable, with 6 having the same value as 9. Frank sighed. Magic, of course. It wasn't a subject that had ever interested him much, mostly because it refused to obey the laws of mathematics. Dad had told him the stuff came in 2 basic sorts, effective and practical, the difference being that when a practical magician turned a policeman into a frog, the result was a genuine frog, whereas if an effective magician did the same trick, what you got was a policeman who believed he was a frog, a belief shared with everybody else in the world. Generally speaking, both types got the job done efficiently enough for the file to be closed and an invoice sent, which was all the bosses cared about. One of the few differences was that maths took no notice of effective magic, while practical messed it up good and proper. Faced with an instance of practical magic, maths was a wheel spinning in mud, unable to grip, which put him in an awkward position. If he couldn't do the maths, he couldn't run the simulations, in which case he couldn't accept the assignment. That would mean going back to George Sprague and breaking it to him that this time he was going to have to pay out on a claim, something that he had an almost religious objection to doing, and Frank liked George Sprague. He was the closest thing Frank had to, well, a friend. It'd be the first time he'd failed. He really didn't want to do it. But if he couldn't run the simulation, deep inside his mind, something small and rather ugly woke up. Thinking about it later, Frank couldn't help personifying it as the little bit of goblin he'd apparently inherited from his father's side of the family. "Go on," it whispered, and its voice was soft and appealing. What harm could it possibly do? Frank shivered. It was a phrase he'd taught himself to react to, the way a woodland animal reacts to the sound of a breaking twig. Besides, the voice went on, it's not as though you'd be doing it for yourself. You know you aren't in this for the money. Not really. Do it for good old George, your pal. Yes, but he tried to get a grip. He tried to concentrate on the fact that he'd beaten George up from 10 to 15% on this job, so it stood to reason that if he took the risk, it'd be because of the money, because of greed. It almost worked. "And then there's the girl," hissed the soft voice. "Only 28, poor kid. Or not less, you could save her." And that, regrettably, was really all it took. The other reasons, which he quickly gathered round him like a hedgehog rolling in dry leaves, were only there for decoration. You don't really know what's going to happen. Even if you do run your daft simulations, you think you're God's gift to calculus, but really you're just guessing. History heals its own wounds. It must do, or else all the other jobs you've done would have made a real mess. His inner goblin was chattering away, but it needn't have bothered. It had nabbed him with a damsel in distress, easy as twitching a bit of string under a cat's nose. Frank stood up. It was funny about the dog, but he wasn't going to argue with a stroke of good luck. The thought made him frown. He didn't like dogs, but he was too soft-hearted to take active steps to get rid of one. He'd even parted with money when ferocious women had shaken collecting tins under his nose in the cause of various homeless dog shelters. It always came back to his strong sense of duty. If someone, or something, liked him, he was morally obliged to like them back, even if he didn't. The sun was viciously hot and bleachingly bright, Mad dogs and Englishman weather. He stepped out from under the shade of the fig tree and hurried back to the door. As he opened it, something prompted him to look back over his shoulder. He paused. Something was missing. He couldn't identify it, but he was aware of that moment of deadly vulnerability that a man gets when he doesn't know for certain where his car keys are. Quick as a snake, he patted his pockets, then remembered that he didn't actually own a car. Couldn't have been that then. Nevertheless, the feeling was dangerously strong. He'd lost or forgotten something, but he couldn't figure out what it was. Maybe it was just the dog. In which case... Far too hot to linger out in the open without a hat, but he went back into the shade of the tree and carefully searched the place where he'd been sitting. Nothing. He carried out the mild obsessive standard kit inspection. The door's cardboard tube, wallet, house keys, palm top, mobile, all present and correct. He tried to remember if he'd been carrying anything else. The file. Yes, got that. The feeling was very strong. This is silly, Frank thought. I've made sure I've got all the important stuff, so whatever I'm missing, by definition, it's not something I'll miss. And, of course, the occasional flash of misplaced instinct was perfectly normal for someone who spent his time whizzing backwards and forwards in time via the door. There were all manner of annoying and bewildering side effects, ranging from mild and vague déjà vu to being able to recite huge chunks of dialogue out of movies he'd never seen, often because they hadn't been made yet. As for detective stories and thrillers, well, forget it. He always knew who'd done it as soon as he opened the cover or saw the opening credits. He caught himself checking his pockets yet again, his fingers groping for a shape and a texture he was unable to specify. Searching for an absence of something is a really bad way to spend time, a bit like trying to play darts blindfold in zero gravity. He ordered himself to stop doing it. He mutinied, and while I'm at it, he thought, I'll keep my eyes peeled for the invisible man. Somehow, Frank managed to get a fragile fingernails-only grip and made long strides back to the door. Doesn't matter, he told himself, because if he really had lost something important and found out later what it was, he could always return through the door to the moment just before he arrived and leave himself a note to remind him to take care not to lose it. There, you see, nothing to worry about. Go on. He stepped through the door, closed it behind him, and caught it as it rolled down his bedroom wall. You could call it home, but only like estate agents call Swindon the Cotswolds. Really, it was just a shed. To be precise, a temporary shelter for shepherds during the summer grazing season in one of the remotest parts of New Zealand's North Island. Frank had chosen it precisely because it was miles from anywhere, or anyone. The sheep station it had originally belonged to had been derelict since the mid-20th century. Nobody came here, not even the movie people. It was practically the only place on the island that hadn't doubled for Rohan or the Shire. He'd bought it, all legal and above board, just to be on the safe side, but he needn't have bothered. Nobody else in the world could possibly live there, except the owner of the portable door. He kicked off his shoes and flopped down on the bed. He had a job to do, but he couldn't summon up the energy. Not like him at all. His motto had always been, there's no time like the present. Completely meaningless for him, of course, but nevertheless. Mostly it was just that he hated sitting still. That was why he'd chosen the hut. It was an ideal home for someone who was always out. He yawned. This is no good, he told himself. You've made the decision, and now there's a poor dead girl out there for you to bring back to life. Get up, busy, busy. Frank closed his eyes. Something was missing, and until he'd worked out what it was and got it back, it wasn't going to feel right. Once again, he toyed with the rather appalling notion that it might just be the dog, but mercifully, that didn't ring true. Not the dog, but possibly something not totally dissimilar, something that was always there, something that followed him about whether he liked it or not. It could well be something like that, except that his life didn't contain anything that fitted that description. He had no bodyguards, disciples, groupies, cameramen or sound crews. As far as he knew, he wasn't being tailed by the police or the CIA or even the VAT people. His defining characteristic was that he was a table for one, so that couldn't be right, could it? Forget it, he told himself as he opened a cupboard and took out a plate and a spoon and dropped them into a carrier bag. Can't be important. Let's get this job of work done and out the way, and then there may be another job to do, and George Sprague was very good at keeping him busy. The main thing was not to stop too long in any one place or at any one time. My life, he decided, is the very antithesis of a posh restaurant. Absolutely no ties. He picked the door out of its tube with the nails of his thumb and forefinger and slapped it onto the wall. The familiar outlines spread and grew a third dimension. He concentrated on the target location and turned the handle. One thing Frank found hard to predict, even when entering a place he knew well, was what the door would choose to open out of. 9 times out of 10, it was a wall. Other useful surfaces included billboards, hoardings, road signs, cliff faces. Once he'd had to materialise in the middle of the Gobi Desert. No vertical surfaces in 10 square miles. On that occasion, the door had turned into a manhole cover, and he'd had something of a shock when he tried to walk through it and tumbled head over heels into the sand. This time, it was reasonably straightforward. He stepped out of a doorway in a garden fence onto a flower bed. There in front of him was an apple tree, with a ladder leaning against its branches. The object of his mission wasn't hard to spot. She was halfway up the ladder, stretching out her arm towards a fat, annoyed-looking cat. Frank cleared his throat and said, "Excuse me." She didn't look down. "Yes," she snapped, in a go-away-I'm-busy voice. "Excuse me," he repeated, "but that doesn't look terribly safe. Would it be all right if—" "Who the hell are you?" George Sprague's briefings were always delightfully rich in minor details. "Kevin Thompson," he said. I'm Mrs. Thompson's nephew. It's a cat again, isn't it?" "Yes. Look, do you think you could just shut up and let me do this? I don't mean to be rude, but I do need to concentrate. Actually, go away." "Oh, well," Frank thought, "and you'll never know I'm just about to save your life." He took the plate and the spoon out the carrier bag. She'd be furious, of course. She'd assume he'd done it to make her look stupid. It didn't matter, needless to say. He'd probably never have anything to do with her ever again, so who cared what she thought? "Here, kitty," he sang out, tapping the spoon against the edge of the plate. "Here, kitty, kitty, kitty." The cat lifted its head and looked at him. "Kitty, kitty, kitty." Tap, tap, tap. "Din-dins. Here, kitty, kitty." The cat gave him a look that would have scarred a more sensitive man for life. But it got to its feet, ran lightly along the branch, hopped down onto a lower one, darted past the girl, brushing her face with its tail as it did so, and ran down the tree trunk to the ground. He put the plate and spoon back in the bag. The cat trotted past the foot of the ladder and vanished through a cat flap in the back door. "Oh, look," Frank said. "He's come down all by himself." The girl still had her back to him, which was probably just as well. He had an idea she wouldn't be happy when she came down off the ladder. He turned to go and took a long stride onto the flower bed, trying hard not to tread on any intentional vegetation. He heard a thump. There are some noises that aren't good. Ever. The thump was one of them. He looked back. The girl was lying on the ground. The angle of her head to her spine was definitely wrong, as though she'd been drawn by a clumsy amateur. She was lying on top of the ladder, which was flat on the ground. There was no sign of the tree. "Oh," Frank thought. He tried to remember the original storyline as set out in George Sprague's briefing. The old lady was due to come out the house at any moment, probably not a good thing if she saw him there. He glanced quickly at the back door, but couldn't see it. The reason being, there was a tree in the way. It was back. "Oh," he thought. Part of his brain said, "Got to be practical then, rather than effective." Effective magic could make her think that the tree had suddenly vanished, causing her to topple off the ladder and fall to her death. But it wouldn't be able to persuade the ladder. But the ladder's lying on the ground with her on top of it. Therefore, someone must have physically removed the tree and then put it back a split second later. Furthermore, put it back about 10 inches off to the side so it wouldn't zap back into existence on top of her dead body. Definitely practical then, rather than effective. Also, according to what Dad used to say about the two different types of magic, extremely difficult to do and a lot of effort to go to when a perfectly simple bit of effective magic would have had the same result. The rest of his brain said, "Oh Jesus, she's dead," and the tree just sort of vanished. Frank heard a door open and crockery smash. Time, he felt, really guilty about running away like this, but he had to be sensible. He wasn't there. So could be that this was all intentional. Interesting. Thank you for bearing with me while I learn how to do an Aussie and New Zealand accent. I really do appreciate it, and I appreciate all of the help and input, because trust me, I need every little bit of help. I never watched Neighbours or Home and Away when I was younger, you see, and that was a long time ago. But it's one of those things where, you know, I love Aussie Man. I've watched Aussie Man for years, and that's what I reckon. Another great YouTuber. You know, there's so many good. The Reese Brothers have been recommended as well by a good friend. There's so many amazing Australian talent out there that I could actually refer to. Viva la Dirt League. We watched the NPC characters. Oh my goodness, that makes me die. It's so funny. The NPC Man series is fantastic. Thank you very, very much to the other for put me onto that one. Sorry, I'm absolutely going on a tangent and I do apologise. But at least you know that it's a human being reading these chapters and not a robot. I'm not a robot yet. I might be if I get a knee replacement, mind. Anyway, if you got to the end of the chapter, I really do very much appreciate it. Very, very much. And as always, if you can hit the like button, always helps the channel. If you can hit the notifications bell, if you want to give it a follow if you don't already, share it if you want to. I'd really appreciate that. But I will be back in a couple of days' time to bring you chapter 5 of the Better Mousetrap, J.W. Wells & Co. Book 5 by Tom Holt. We love reading it here. And the most important thing is, take it easy, stay safe, pal. See you soon, and thanks for listening. I appreciate you.